So tell me, what's your take on the parable of Baby Bird? As you heard the story, what were your impressions? Did you identify with any particular character? And if so, which one? Perhaps you identified with Mr. and Mrs. Bird. If so, do you think that Baby Bird was irresponsible? Did he have a bad attitude? Was he the cause of his parents' troubles? Or perhaps your sympathies went naturally to Baby. Were the parents the cause of his difficulties? Were they over-involved, nagging, overprotective? Did the trouble lie in the way they were raising their fledgling bird? Did they fail to bond with him properly, perhaps? Or was he the product of a dysfunctional family? Well, if we analyze the situation in any of these ways, it's not surprising, for this is the way most of us have been taught to think. We learn to dissect situations in a linear way to find out exactly what the root cause of a problem was. And once we isolate the cause, we can diagnose and treat it. Where human beings are involved, this often means placing blame on somebody. And that approach may be rational if we're in the business of, say, repairing simple machines. But with human beings, it doesn't always work so well. Finding a person to blame, one person to blame, can be destructive. It divides people from one another. Sometimes it can mark a person for life. But the good news is that there's another way of thinking about interpersonal situations. There's another way of seeing things that's both more humane and more accurate, I think. It's called systems theory. No doubt you've encountered it before in some context. It's as old as the Tao Te Ching, but it's also one of the most important intellectual developments of the last 100 years or so. It's been applied to history, the sciences, sports, congregational studies, and family therapy. Systems theory never sees parts in isolation from one another. It always looks at them as they interconnect to form a whole. As a consequence, it tends to shy away from blaming because it rejects the idea of linear causation, that A caused B, which in turn caused C, which in turn caused D and E. It looks at all of these as part of a network, a web. A change in any component is going to have reverberations throughout the system. It occurs to me that our UU principles reflect systems thinking when they speak of the interdependent web of all existence. When a spider's web moves, the entire web adjusts to rebalance itself. A vibration in any part is felt throughout. No one tries to isolate one part of the web and define it separately. Now, back in the 1950s, a psychiatrist named Murray Bowen had the intuition that families are like webs. Bowen was working at the Menninger Foundation as a fairly traditional psychiatrist. And at that time, mental health professionals were discouraged from contacting their patients' families. This was thought to interfere with the healing process. But Dr. Bowen found himself getting curious about the families of his patients, wondered about them, decided maybe he should study them. And from doing this, he began to see the family not as a collection of individuals, but as an emotional unit. The way one family member functioned seemed to depend on the behavior of all the other members. For example, maybe this sounds familiar to some of you. Dr. Bowen found that no family started out with strong or weak members. But sometimes a curious thing would happen. One member of the family would display vulnerability or weakness, as everybody does from time to time. and then another would become strong to compensate. And this encouraged the so-called weak family member to become even weaker. And eventually it spiraled into a chronic situation in which the person was labeled as weak. This pattern was observed with other traits. One family member would insist on making all the decisions, and this would render other members incapable of making any decisions at all. Or one member would become highly emotional, while another became extremely rational, as if to balance things out. Or if one family member sought greater closeness, another would back off, seeking distance. And this would continue until the first person finally gave up and abandoned the quest for intimacy. Well, at that point, the distancer would move toward the other in hot pursuit. Perhaps you've noticed this phenomenon in some of your own relationships. Couples certainly discover it. It even has a name, the Bowen Two-Step. Well, how do we apply this kind of analysis to our friends, the birds? We can start by simply observing what's going on, resisting the temptation to place blame. And if we do this, we may begin to notice a few things. We may notice, for instance, that the emotional playing field in this family is pretty intense right now. Up until now, the bird family has never had any trouble with their offspring. They've all left the nest on schedule. But this time, something has changed. For the very first time, the parents are eager to get on with the rest of their lives to begin a new chapter. So they not only want baby to leave for his own sake, they also need him to leave. This raises the emotional stakes and therefore the anxiety. Could that have anything to do with baby's fear of flying? A little anxiety can be motivating, but a lot is paralyzing. So baby feels the tension, resists, and goes into a nosedive. And all this does is escalate the system's anxiety even more. But notice that something else is happening with the anxiety. It not only escalates, it redistributes itself. Baby might have worried about flying at the beginning, but now he stops worrying about himself, and who can blame him? His parents are doing more than enough worrying for the whole family. In the language of family therapy, baby bird is the identified patient. In other words, he's the one a casual observer would pick as the one with the problem, but he's really only the symptom bearer, manifesting something, anxiety perhaps, that belongs to the whole family unit. And the longer baby's problem becomes the focus of attention, the worse it gets. Everyone becomes rigid, locked into unhelpful modes of relating. The automatic response is to dig in and try even harder to fix things, but the only true solution may be to relax and back off, as Mr. and Mrs. Bird finally apparently do. So the fable of soaring is a simple example designed to introduce a complex topic. It only begins to impart the flavor of systems thinking about our families. It's an invitation to explore the workings of our most important relationships, including those in our congregation. Now, when we examine our families of origin and their patterns of relating, many factors come into play that we can look at. One thing is our place in the birth order and everything that goes with that, whether we're the oldest, the youngest, somewhere in the middle, or an only child. If we have siblings, we may discover that they experienced our family very differently from the way we did, simply for being born at a different time and into a different context. Another factor is our family's wider history. When we were growing up, what other events were taking place, either within our families or in the wider world? How did these events color the emotional climate or put special pressure on us? For instance, I was born in 1946, right after the war. What effect did that have on my life? Or say a beloved grandparent died the year we were born. How did that affect the way our parents responded to us? Emotional patterns can be handed down from generation to generation, and the reasons our families are the way they are may be lost in time or may actually be discoverable with some excavation. To give a personal example, I had always feared I was the odd one out in my nuclear family, since I am the only one who's never born children. But then when I took a family systems class, I made a chart, a genogram of my extended family. It was for both sides and it went back 6 generations. And in the process, I learned something interesting, that precious few of the first grandchildren in the family had ever had kids of their own. For reasons I still don't understand, first grandchildren were rarely the domestic ones in the family. Rather, we were the ones to leave home, go on adventures. Giving birth or raising children, also a great adventure, but of a different kind, was assigned to other siblings. I can't tell you how helpful it was for me to learn that as the oldest grandchild on both sides of my family. I realized I wasn't weird after all. I was simply carrying on the family tradition. And realizing this, I began to feel less lonely in my family. I fit into the grand scheme of things after all. I had a role to play in the family system. How has your family shaped you? We can get an inkling of that by noticing what happens when we visit our relatives. If you visit your family, when you do you feel comfortable and secure? Do you feel you can be fully yourself? Can you express your thoughts and feelings freely in a calm way? If so, you're really lucky. You may instead find yourself tightening up with apparently nothing to say. You may feel small and diminished with your true self on hold. And perhaps if you visit your parents, you may find you're transformed like magic into a 13-year-old, even if you are 60 and they are 90. If that sounds familiar, take heart, you're not alone. Many people, most people perhaps, experience a loss of freedom with their families of origin. Everyone develops a strategy for dealing with it, some productive, some not so much. Some of us come to family gatherings in combat mode, armor in place. I've been there myself. We're determined. This time things will be different. We'll say what's on our mind, and this will cause our families to change. Yeah, good luck with that. Others of us adopt a different strategy. We withdraw from our families, even give up on them. Sometimes we do this by adopting the geographic cure, moving far away, thinking that that will make us free. Or if creating physical distance isn't possible, we withdraw internally. We maintain a polite distance at family gatherings, and we go elsewhere for our real relationships. And sometimes we have to do that, of course, for our own safety. But even when cutting ourselves off keeps us safe, it may still not be a total solution. If we don't understand the ways in which we carry our families around with us, we may simply blindly repeat old patterns. And when we're completely cut off from our families of origin, we may bring a desperate intensity to other relationships, trying to get from our friends and lovers what we couldn't get from our parents. The family systems approach offers a third way. It's hard work, but it can be fun too, with potential great rewards. The key in systems terms is to differentiate from our families, not to attack, not to withdraw, but to stay connected while staying true to our values. It's a learned response, a discipline, taking time and patience and practice. It means learning maybe not to react so much when our buttons are pushed, maybe to pause rather and take a deep breath, and maybe ask some questions. In other words, we might start by taking a research stance toward our families of origin. When we connect with our parents or siblings, even if it's from a long distance, by letter or phone, we could pretend for the time that we are anthropologists studying our family. So we could ask our parents, what keeps them awake at night? Or what was it like to be a daughter or son of their parents and offspring? This will at least give us a fruitful topic of conversation beyond the weather or contentious politics. And it gives us the chance to go deep, understanding our families better and perhaps ourselves as well. Let me share one more personal story. I began all this work back in the 1990s, and I started asking questions about and then to my family of origin. And since my mother had a life-threatening illness, I concentrated first on her side of the family. Well, the summer before she died, I hit pay dirt. That is, I stumbled on a family secret. And at one level, it shocked me. At another, it made complete intuitive sense. I'd been trying to find out more about my maternal grandfather's alcoholism. This in itself had been a family secret until the early 80s. Then one of my sisters let it drop, almost in casual conversation, that my sainted grandfather had spent a year in prison after being stopped once too often for driving while intoxicated. And this had happened not in the deep, dark past, but when I was 6 in 1952. So I heard that, and then I had to pick myself up off the floor. But I began to put things together, and it all made sense. It was as though a missing puzzle piece had been supplied, and other pieces were now falling in around it. For instance, I remembered the deep anxiety I had about school in the first grade. And then there was this unexplained gap in our vacations with Mom's parents. More important, I knew that my mother's relationship had changed significantly around that time. She had become very strict and severe and preoccupied with our family being normal, quote unquote. Never mind that adult children of alcoholics always have to guess at what normal really is. And suddenly I understood my mother in a new way. Compassion and appreciation welled up as I realized the pain she must have experienced growing up. It felt as though a barrier had been removed from our connections. Family secrets hold such power over us. My family's secret had existed underground for almost 40 years before it came to light in my generation. And now in the telling, some of its power was broken. I wonder what healing it might have brought had it been uncovered earlier or had never been a secret at all. This is just one example of the power of understanding our families. When we find the courage to engage our families of origin, even from a distance, we can begin to break the power of unhelpful or destructive patterns in our own lives. And we may begin to see our parents as fallible, struggling human beings, a little like ourselves. And in this lies the promise of freedom, not the freedom of wandering alone with no restrictions, not the so-called freedom of baby bird refusing to flap his wings, rather the freedom that comes from understanding who we are and where we started and how far we've come, and of acting from our deepest, most authentic selves. When we find that freedom, then we really begin to soar.